An Ideal Match by Anne Harris. It was a beautiful morning in June, sun streaming through the leaded lights of the parlor window, softening the light shabbiness of old furniture and playing over the glass lustres on the mantelpiece to shower the room with a rainbow color. The woman sitting by the window had a wistful experience in her eyes as she looked out on the garden filled with roses and fragrant flowers, their perfume wafted on the gentle breeze towards her. Jane Osborne sighed, conscious of a faint ennui which she was struggling to throw off. She had no right to feel bored. There was always so much to occupy her, but she longed for some excitement, something that would take her away from domestic problems. She was too familiar with her home to notice any fraying of curtains or wear on the arms of comfortable sofa, nor she would have been particularly concerned if she had. Her mind had for the past hour been wrestling with more important things, like the loss of some five hens to a fox the previous night and the general running of the family estate, which had been in her charge for several years now. Oh, bother! She muttered herself to stood up, determined to shake off this uncountable mood of self-indulgence. Her life was her order to as she wished, and it is quite her own fault if she was sitting at home moping when she might just easily be out visiting friends. This really will not do. She glanced up as someone knocked at the door. Captain Carter has called. Miss, said Jane, little parlor maid, hesitating in the doorway, a faint flush in her cheeks. And this letter was delivered for you a moment ago. Thank you, Bessie. Jane took the letter from the silver salver. She noticed the girl flush and suspected for a reason for it. Captain Carter still thought himself the dashing young officer who had many years previously been the toast of every London society hostess, but now one of Jane's trio of devoted but highly unsuitable suitors and incapable of greeting any female without quizzing her. He had been a kind friend to her father, visiting Mr. Osborne most days during his long and distressing illness, and a good neighbor to her. Jane liked him, despite his unfortunate habit of asking her to marry him and at least once a month. As the captain too, she gave a cry of distress as she opened the letter and found it had come from a London solicitor whose name she did not recognize. No, stay, Bessie. Please ask Captain Carter to call again tomorrow if he will. Tell him I am indisposed for the moment. Is something wrong, miss? Bessie ventured to ask, knowing her mistress well enough to fear being through thought impertinent. Miss Jane was the one of the best, kindest ladies ever born, and if anyone ever asked, Bessie would swear to it. Not that it was likely, she being only a servant and beneath the notice of some. Indeed, in most households, she would not have been permitted to speak unless spoken to. But Miss Jane never showed anything but respect and an unfailing courtesy towards her people, just as she did the old flirt waiting in the main parlor. If it had been up to Bessie, she would have shown certain folk the door long ago. But Miss Jane was a real lady. Not bad news, I hope, miss. Yes, I fear it is, Jane said as he read on quickly. An old friend of my mother has died, and her ward is coming to visit with us. Good gracious, it seems we must expect her within a few days. Pray tell Mrs. Braggs the best guest chamber will need airing. She broke off as the both heard something, and the girl moved aside to allow a young man to enter the parlor. He was dressed in the height of fashion. His boots had a super gloss. His hair was incapably cut. His pantaloons fitted to his shapely thighs like a second skin. His coat had been fashioned at the hands of a master, and his cravat was a work of art. All of this was not lost on Jane, who stared at him in surprise and some disquiet. John, she cried, starting to her feet. What are you doing home? Is something wrong? I'll explain later, he said, avoiding her eyes. His manner was sheepish, and he guessed what might behind in his unexpected arrival. It was just a prank, Jane, but old Phillips made such as fuss that. Thank you, Bessie. You may go. Jane waited until the door closed behind the girl before giving her brother a searching look. You haven't been sent down. She read the answer in his guilty face. Oh, John, why? Jane did not believe she was being overly prejudiced in his favor to think him an exceptionally handsome man. His dark hair suited him, cut in the style long favored by Mr. Brummel, and his shoulders were wide enough for fashion without excessive padding. Blessed with considerable charm and intelligence, he was very dear to her, but there was no doubting that he could on occasion be a very troublesome young man, especially when he had been drinking with his friends, who were apt to be wild when in their cups. We had a little too much wine, he confessed, a look of shame in his dark brown eyes. There were three of us, and I drew the short straw. I'd had run old Phillips unmentionables the flagful of water. All the fellows turned out to see and caused a bit of rumpus. No wonder he was cross. Jane shook her head at him, trying her best not to laugh, but not succeeding. It was a foolish thing to do, my dear, but hardly enough to get you set down. Indeed, I think you have been harshly treated. Well, that's what we thought. Her brother sighed and ruffled his hair artistically. Apparently, it was the last straw, and, truth to tell, we had been cutting a few larks all term, so he decided to make an example of us. We've all been sent home. I suppose it was bound to happen, she said, accepting the fact because there was no point in making a fuss over something that couldn't be helped. As it happens, it may be more fortunate than you supposed. Now that you're here, you will be able to help run the state. It seems that I am to have a more passing duty. John Osborne relaxed and breathed a deep sigh of relief. He had been giving himself some stick as he rode home, imagining an unpleasant scene. He was an amiable young man who always preferred to take the easy line if possible, and being as fond of his sister as she was of him, would have hated to be in her bad books. Jane had indeed been almost like a mother to him since their dearest mamma had died of a fever 10 years earlier. In the intervening years, Jane had been a tireless helpmate meet to their grieving father, giving up her one distant chance of marriage to nurse Mr. Osborne when his health began to decline. John knew he owed her a great deal. It was nearly a year now since brother and sister had stood together, united in grief, at Mr. Osborne's graveside. If it had not been for Jane, John would have been forced to take the burden of the state long ago, thus forfeiting several years of freedom. He had used those years to sow his wild oats, and now felt ready to support his sister. "You're a complete sport, Johnny," he said. "Most sisters would have cut up rough or read me a lecture." "It would be useless," she replied, sending him a look of mild reproof mingled with affection. "Father wanted you to have a good education, but I never thought you were suited to an academic life. The army might have been more to your liking." "I've let father down." John looked ashamed. "And you?" "Not at all," she replied in a bracing tone. "I am not in the least put by your coming home sooner than when we expected. I have been in the fidgets lately, but now it is all changed. I warn you, I shall rely on you to help me out once Amanda arrives." "Amanda?" He looked at her in surprise. As well he might never having heard of the girl previously. "Who is Amanda?" Jane paused for thought, turning the glance for herself for a moment on the heavily carved, gold-framed wall mirror. She was perhaps dressed a little less fashionably than her brother, but had a natural air of elegance, which more than made up for anything her gown lacked. Her luxuriant dark hair was swept up in a shining coronet, which gave her a regal look. She had a clear skin, fine features, and eyes that were more green than hazel just at that moment. But she looked tired to her brother's way of thinking. Too much of her youth had been squandered one on the care of an invalid and the duties of not inconsiderable state. "Do you remember Miss Mary Roberts?" Jane asked. "She used to come and stay when we were younger. She was Mamma's best friend. I like her very much, but I hadn't heard from her for almost 2 years. Now, I've learned a little late in a day. What she died that she died 3 months back, and apparently her will, which they were unable to find for some time, nominated me to take over her role as the guardian of a young girl. Amanda is, or was, her great niece, and Mary was Wardwin since her parents were drowned in a shipwreck some years ago. I believe they were on their way home from India, where they had spent some time as missionaries. Amanda is, of course, still too young to handle her own affairs, and it seems for some reason known best to herself. Mary Roberts decided I was the fittest person to have charge of her." "She had no right to do that," John exclaimed. "And I not on her behalf. To lumber you with the charge of a girl you didn't know, without even consulting you, is the outside of enough. You should refuse to accept." Mary Roberts was very rich, Jane said, wisely ignoring her brother's outburst. She has left a handsome bequest to me, and the remainder of her fortune in trust for Amanda. She will have a generous income of her own, so I shall not be burdened in that way. That is something, John admitted, but you will never the less be obliged to put yourself out of the girl. How old is she? Not yet 18. I shall have to think of taking her to London at some times in the future, but she is a little young to be introduced into society for the moment. We often entertain our friends at her at the lodge, so it will serve us as a mean of overcoming any shyness she may at first suffer. Jane gave her a barrier of smile of sweetness. I think I shall enjoy having a child to stay. It will give me a new interest. You will be kind to her, won't you, dearest? For your sake, of course. He bent to drop a kiss on the top of her head. I saw one of the troublesome trio as I came through. Do they still plague with their attentions? Jane nodded, her mouth quirking as she tried to surpass her myth. I fear thee, though. The poor dears! I have tried, again and again, to convince them all that I have no thought of marriage, but they all seem to imagine that I cannot survive without one of them to take care of me, that I am really eager to be married. Her eyes lit with amusement, but she did her best to suppress it. It really was too bad of her to laugh when they were all so kind. To one of them? I should hope not indeed. John did not try to hide disgust. If you wanted a husband, which you probably don't, being no longer a green girl and settled in your ways, I'm sure you could do better than the trio. John smiled his indignation and all too accurate description of herself, then shook her head. At 6 and 20 was she was at 6 and 20 she was very much on the shelf. Any chance of making a good marriage, the kind that would be agreeable to her, had passed her by. The fact that she had been ardently pursued by her three unsuitable admirers for several months was a source of continuing amusement to her, though she had no illusions concerning their various reasons for wanting to marry her. The Reverend Bertie Burroughs, plump, flatulent, and an endless bore to the plant each Sunday, was enamored of excellent dinners she gave regularly for her friends and neighbors. Having endured the tasteless efforts of his housekeeper in the draughty dining room at the vicarage, Jane couldn't blame him for coveting a permanent place at her table. Captain Carter had tried from a lifetime service in his regiment, a bit of dasher with both the ladies and his hunter. He rode better than the most men in the country and had an eye for a pretty ankle. Of the three, Jane liked him best. Unfortunately, he was an unlucky gambler and needed a wife with a fortune of her own to restore his crumbling state. Sir Charles Pendebury was comfortably off, but having seen his third wife recently buried, and with a brood of six noisy children, all under the age of 14, was desperate to marry her again. Jane had never for one moment considered marrying any of them, but felt a certain sympathy towards them, was grateful for their friendship, which had saved her from great deal of boredom these past months, and resolutely gentle in rebuffing their advances. I have no intentions of marrying, she told her brother now. For the moment, I am content here. We have always got on well, I think, and when you marry, I shall take a house in Bath and visit you twice a year. You will not, John denied hotly. This is your home, as much as you mind, and shall never leave it, unless you marry a man you love. How fierce you are, dearest John, said his amused sister. I am not likely to fall in love at my age, and do not wish for a marriage of convenience. No, I am quite content with my life for the time being, and I do not think you are ready to take a wife just yet. Not for years, he declared stoutly. All I want is to learn the business of state and make you proud of me. Then you shall start today. Us need to have our own horses saddled and we'll ride over to the home farm and talk to Perry Meadows. He has a problem with the roof of his barn. I'll see the horses at once, John said and walked to the door. Pausing there, he looked back at her. Thank you for not making me feel more stupid than I already been. We shall forget the incident, she said, slipping her letter into the top drawer of the bureau. I'm glad to have you home, John. He was convinced of her sincerity and left without further ado. She sighed as he closed the door behind him. The letter from the mayor's Robert solicitor had caused her far more concern than her brother being sent down from university. She would do her best for the unfortunate girl, of course, and she prepared to be sympathetic. Amanda would naturally be grieving for her great aunt, who had cared for her since the tragic death of her parents. They would all have to do their best to raise her spirits when she arrived. She wasn't expected for a few days, time enough for Jane to get used to the idea of having a young girl in her charge. It was such a lovely afternoon, the air soft and warm, drowsing to the sound of bees droning, tiny birds drilling their impatient song on the branches of scabby gorse bushes, or flitting from one patch of wild flowers to another. Jane was enjoying her ride across the wide sweep of the moor, which was dotted with large boulders here and there and cut through by shallow, tumbling stream. She had earlier been for a wild gallop to settle her mare, who had been frisky after a couple of days spent in the stable, and now she canteringly gently, making her way home in time for a tea. The sharp crack of a pistol shot somewhere nearby made her mare prick its stairs and nod uneasily. The shot had not been close enough to cause dainty Miss to bolt had it come from somewhere ahead. Jane spurred the horse on and, as she passed the clustered boulders which had obscured her view, was shocked to see a man lying on the ground. Dismounting hastily, she hurried the man aside and knelt beside him on rough ground, peering anxiously into his face, which she could not help noticing was exceptionally handsome. His hair was black as a raven's wing, and when he opened his eyes and stared up at her, when he did, to her relief, almost at once, she saw they were very clear as blue. "Don't blast him," the stranger muttered as he sat up, then glared at her suspiciously. Who the blazes are you?" "Jane Osborne," she said, not in the least disturbed by his less than polite greeting. In the circumstances, his choice of words was really quite mild. "I was riding and heard a shot." He touched the side of his head. She was horrified to see blood on his fingers. Until that moment, she had not truly realized how close we had some come to being killed, and it gave her a turn. "That rogue winged me," he muttered, apparently more indignant than distressed. "Dumped his eyes. Someone actually shot you." "Good gracious! I thought I must have been an incident. Some after a hare, perhaps. Did you see who it was?" "Some wretch, a highwayman," he muttered. "Had the effrontery to ask for my purse, and I told him what he might do. I had not heard that there was a highwayman in the area." She frowned and struggled rather than unsteadily to his feet, catching at her arm for a moment to steady himself. "Are you badly hurt, sir?" "Shaken rather than hurt," he said, his eyes narrowing as he looked at her. She sensed that his pride was more damaged than his head. "I dare say the rogue meant only to scare me, but he'll pray for it if we ever meet again." "We must hope you won't." Jane shivered, feeling goosebumps all over as she thought of what he might have happened. "I suppose your horse was frightened off by the shot." She glanced around for some sign it would, but could see none. "I was on foot." He glared at her once more, an air of defiance about him now. "I am an amateur botanist, and I was looking for wildflowers. An odd specimen for a man, you may feel." Jane did, but was too polite to say so. It struck her that he was extremely well turned out, and looked more suited to the hallowed present of a gentleman's glove than studious life of botanist, amateur or otherwise. There was perhaps something a little mysterious here. "My home is not far across there, a mile or so." She pointed out the direction with her whip. "My mare will carry us both for that short distance, and I should like, if you will permit me, to tend your wound and give you a little brandy for the shock." She gave him a winning smile as he hesitated. "I confess I should be glad of your company if they're such wicked rogues of the moor." "I am very willing to see you safely home, ma'am," he said, as she had known he must, because he was gentleman. He was gentleman, and no gentleman could refuse to escort a lady when she might be in danger. "But I should not burden your horse with my weight. Why do we not talk together since your home is so near?" "An excellent suggestion," she agreed readily, falling in with his wishes out of desire to see him safely attended. To write off and leave a man who had come within inches of losing his wife was something Jane could never do, but she could